Today's story will take us deep into the legend of a Japanese man who not only succeeded in escaping from prison 4 times, but whose methods were not merely clever, they were nothing short of legendary. These extraordinary escape operations transformed him into a true icon within the annals of Japanese prison history. Our protagonist is Yoshi Shiratori, a man who stands as the embodiment of the prison escape legend. Yoshi's journey began in a world that was anything but kind. He was born into a difficult family, one that was caught in the grip of an even harsher society. In the early part of his life, Yoshi sought to live honestly, trying to make a living through legitimate means. But as the realities of his world began to close in on him, his life veered off course. Faced with failure and hardship, Yoshi turned to gambling and theft. Eventually, he was arrested, not for theft, but for murder. He found himself accused of a crime he insisted he did not commit, claiming his confession had been extracted under the brutal force of beatings and torture. In 1936, Yoshi was thrown into Aomori prison, a place that would become his personal hell. Life behind those bars was an unrelenting nightmare. Day in and day out, the guards subjected him to savage beatings, their cruelty unchecked and merciless. The prison system of that time, roughly 85 years ago, was deeply corrupt. Guards held unchecked power, especially over those prisoners they deemed troublesome, or who were incarcerated for particularly infuriating crimes. Shiratori became one of their victims. Amid this constant torment, and with the weight of an unjust accusation on his shoulders, Yoshi made a decision that would change his life forever. He would escape. And not just escape. He would make it legendary. The first step of any successful escape is understanding the enemy, and Yoshi was no stranger to strategy. He studied the guards' routines with meticulous care. He discovered that during the early morning hours, patrols were sparse, with roughly a 15-minute gap between shifts. This provided him with the perfect window to make his move. At precisely 5:30 a.m., his plan was set into motion. Armed with nothing but a small metal wire he'd secretly kept hidden in his cell's bathroom area, Yoshi began his escape. The wire was a tool he was well acquainted with from his past as a thief, and it soon became his key to freedom. He waited for the patrol to pass by, then set to work on the lock of his cell door. After several tense moments, the door clicked open, but the escape was far from over. Behind the cell door lay several more locked barriers, each one standing between him and freedom. But Yoshi's lock-picking skills were legendary, honed over years of practice, and the locks themselves were not particularly advanced for the time. One by one, he picked them, working swiftly but carefully, until finally he reached the outer prison wall. The climb ahead seemed impossible, but Yoshi, with all his determination, made it over. The locks were relatively simple, and Yoshi's expertise gave him the edge. But even after breaking free, he knew the danger wasn't over. The guards would be back soon. He needed a distraction, something to keep them from discovering his absence before he could escape entirely. So, he removed the floorboards in his cell, tucking them under a blanket and creating the illusion that he was still inside, lying in bed. When the guards passed by, they believed him to be asleep and were completely fooled. His escape, however, did not last long. 3 days later, after being unable to seek proper medical care for the injuries he'd sustained, Yoshi tried to sneak into a hospital to steal supplies. Unfortunately, a few hospital staff members recognized him and alerted the authorities. He was caught again and sent to a new prison, Akita prison, where the conditions were even more brutal. The treatment there was harsher than ever. Now, labeled not only a murderer but also a failed escapee, Yoshi became the focus of relentless punishment. The guards subjected him to beatings, torturing him to set an example for other prisoners. He was forced to endure hard labor, often without a mattress, sleeping on cold concrete floors. Worse still, he was confined to a tiny solitary cell, a windowless tower with a ceiling too high for anyone to reach. The only light came from a small window set far above the ground. For all intents and purposes, escape from such a cell was impossible. But Yoshi was no ordinary man. Even in the face of such severe oppression, he remained undeterred. He was kept in shackles at all times, enduring beatings and further humiliations. Yet, in a rare act of empathy, the head guard, Kobayashi, offered him a small measure of kindness, asking after his well-being whenever he could. That small kindness, however fleeting, would spark something inside Yoshi, a fire that would drive him to do the impossible once again. On the night of July 15th, 1942, the impossible became reality. When the guards opened the door to Yoshi's cell to check on him, they were shocked to find it empty. His bed remained, with the handcuffs that had once bound him lying untouched. Yoshi had escaped once again. But how? How did he free himself from that high, fortified cell with its seemingly unbreakable iron bars? The answer was simple, yet extraordinary. With his uncanny skills as a lockpicker, Yoshi managed to free himself from the handcuffs just as he had done before. But the real challenge lay in reaching the tiny window high in the ceiling, through which no man was supposed to escape. Yoshi, however, had one talent that no one could ever have predicted. He was a master of wall climbing. Using his exceptional agility, he scaled the walls of his cell and worked tirelessly to remove the wooden window frame. It took 6 months of nightly persistence, each day carefully avoiding suspicion, before he finally broke through. But instead of escaping immediately, he waited for the perfect moment. That moment came on a stormy night, when heavy rain and howling winds masked his movements. Under the cover of the storm, Yoshi made his final, daring break for freedom. For 3 months, his escape remained undetected. Then, one evening, as fate would have it, Kobayashi was at home when there was a knock on his door. To his shock, when he opened it, there stood Yoshi Shiratori, the man who had escaped from one of the most secure prisons in Japan. Yoshi looked at Kobayashi, his face full of determination, and said, "I've come to you. You're the only one who showed me kindness, and now I need you to listen to me. You're the only one who cared enough to show concern. Please give me a chance to explain." Kobayashi, still in shock, allowed Yoshi to enter. Yoshi, in a calm voice, confessed that he had indeed escaped, willing to surrender himself. But the reason for his escape, he explained, was simple. The unbearable conditions, the relentless torture, and the inhumane treatment he had suffered at the hands of the guards. In his heart, Yoshi Shiratori desired nothing more than fair and humane treatment. He expressed his weariness with living life as a fugitive, rejecting the idea of being forever on the run. Instead, he sought to have his voice heard by those higher in the judicial system. He wanted the authorities to understand the depths of the corruption and cruelty ingrained in the prison system. It was a desperate plea for justice, an attempt to reform the very system that had condemned him. He confided in Kobayashi, the head guard who had shown him a hint of compassion, telling him that he had turned to him because Kobayashi was the only one he trusted within the prison's walls. With his position and authority, Kobayashi could add credibility to his story. Yoshi's ultimate goal was not to continue his escape as an outlaw, but to seek a fair trial where he could defend himself, especially as he still maintained his innocence in the crime for which he had been sentenced. This was an ambitious plan, and Yoshi knew he couldn't achieve it alone. Without a sympathetic ear from someone in power, like Kobayashi, the likelihood of success was slim. Kobayashi, still stunned by Yoshi's sudden appearance, suggested he take a shower and prepare some food before they continued their conversation. Yoshi, filled with hope, thought that this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to change his fate. But in a cruel twist of fate, moments later, Yoshi was surrounded by police officers. The same authorities he'd hoped to reach out to now stood before him, arresting him once again. His brief moment of trust and the hope it ignited was shattered. That day, Yoshi vowed never to trust another soul again. Back in prison, this time, things would be different. During his trial, Yoshi made a formal request to be transferred to Tokyo, citing the milder climate compared to the freezing northern prisons like Aomori and Akita. However, his request was denied, and instead he was sent to Abashiri prison, the coldest and most isolated prison in all of Japan. The authorities sought to make an example of him, showing other prisoners the consequences of daring to escape. Abashiri, notorious for its severe conditions, was Japan's equivalent to Alcatraz. Surrounded by relentless snow and icy winds, even if a prisoner somehow managed to escape, survival in the freezing wilderness was near impossible. When Yoshi arrived at Abashiri in the winter of 1943, the prison's brutal conditions greeted him. The temperatures inside the cells were sub-zero. Shackled to the cold concrete floor, Yoshi's clothing was insufficient to combat the freezing chill. As the guards left him there, the sound of their laughter echoed in the empty cell, cruelly mocking his fate. Fighting back against the despair, Yoshi tried to rise above the situation, his fury igniting an inner strength that pushed him to stand defiantly. In that moment, he managed to break his shackles, an extraordinary feat that revealed one of his most remarkable traits, an immense physical strength that was far beyond the ordinary. However, this only made things worse. The guards now understood just how dangerous Yoshi truly was and created a new, specially designed cell for him. This new prison was reinforced with metal walls and an incredibly strong door, too small for any human to squeeze through. To further suppress him, the guards placed iron shackles weighing 20 kilograms on his hands and legs, locking him in an almost immovable state. The restraints were welded shut, with no keys to unlock them, and were removed only once every 2 weeks for Yoshi to bathe. The conditions were unbearable, cold, immobilized, and isolated. No one would have believed escape was possible under these extreme conditions, but Yoshi was no ordinary prisoner. After 6 months of enduring these harsh circumstances, he initiated one of the most ingenious escape plans in history. On the night of August 26, 1943, a guard entered his cell for a routine check, only to find it empty. All that remained were his bed, neatly folded clothes, and the iron shackles, which had been broken open. The key to his escape was a simple yet brilliant idea. The prison served a salty miso soup, which Yoshi began to use to his advantage. Salt, known for accelerating rusting, was applied to his iron restraints in the metal frame of the cell window. Over the course of months, the salt slowly corroded the metal, weakening it. It was a meticulous process, especially since Yoshi's hands were bound behind his back, but he persevered. He applied the soup to the restraints in ways that would evade detection, focusing on the joints and areas less visible to the welders who removed them every 2 weeks. In addition to his mastery of rust, Yoshi had another extraordinary skill. He could dislocate his joints voluntarily. While this might sound unbelievable, it was a skill that allowed him to slip through the small window of his cell, despite it being designed to be too narrow for a person to pass through. As fate would have it, on the night of August 26th, a power outage swept through the prison. This rare event provided the perfect cover for Yoshi to carry out his escape. With darkness surrounding him, he quickly worked to detach the metal screws holding the window frame in place. Then, with his arm dislocated, he squeezed through the small opening, climbed to the roof, and broke through a glass window to make his final escape. Yoshi Shiratori had done the impossible. He became the first and last man to escape from the infamous Abashiri prison, a feat so remarkable that it would forever be etched in the annals of Japanese prison history. Today, the prison stands as a museum, with a model depicting Yoshi's incredible moment of freedom, the moment he emerged onto the roof, shattered the glass, and vanished into the night. Yet, even after this miraculous escape, Yoshi's troubles were far from over. Abashiri prison was in the heart of a vast, snow-covered wilderness, far from civilization. Though the authorities launched an intense manhunt, Yoshi left no trace behind. People assumed he had perished in the harsh cold or fallen prey to the predators that roamed the mountains. But in reality, the legend of Yoshi Shiratori had only just begun. Shiratori found an abandoned mine deep in the Hokkaido mountains, a perfect shelter to shield himself from the brutal cold and predators lurking in the wilderness. Over time, he adapted to survive on a diet of wild berries, nuts, and the occasional rabbit, learning to fish from the nearby streams. Amidst the solitude of the mountains, Shiratori embraced a life cut off from civilization, away from anyone who might still be hunting him down. However, the isolation was not without its costs. His longing for his wife and young daughter, whom he had left behind when he was imprisoned, grew stronger each passing day. Nearly a decade had passed since he last saw them, and he knew that returning to them was an impossible dream under his current circumstances. Yet, the vastness of the mountains offered him peace, even as time seemed to stretch on forever. 2 years into his seclusion, Shiratori made the decision to venture into populated areas once again, his first foray into the outside world since his escape from Abashiri prison. Upon entering the nearest town, he was struck by the unfamiliar sight of American soldiers strolling down the streets, and billboards everywhere were now written in English. Intrigued, he snatched a newspaper and began flipping through it, hoping to make sense of the world that had shifted beyond his knowledge. It was then that he learned the shocking news. The nuclear bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan had surrendered in 1945. This revelation sent a ripple of hope through him. The authorities might have forgotten about him. He could have become a man no longer worth pursuing. With a renewed sense of determination, Shiratori embarked on a long journey to reunite with his family. 50 days of walking from town to town eventually brought him to Sapporo. There, hunger gnawed at him as he passed a solitary farm and saw a patch of tomato plants. Driven by desperation, he entered the farm to gather food. Unfortunately, a farmer spotted him and mistook him for one of the many thieves who frequently plundered the crops. The confrontation escalated quickly, and in the chaos, the farmer fell and struck his head on a rock, ultimately dying from the injury. The commotion brought people to the scene, and soon Shiratori found himself apprehended once more. After all his efforts to evade capture, he was now arrested for an unexpected crime. The police soon discovered his true identity, the man who had escaped from the infamous Abashiri prison. He was brought to trial in Sapporo, facing charges far graver than before, with the death of the farmer now ruled as murder, resulting in a death sentence. In 1947, Shiratori was transferred to Sapporo's local prison, where he awaited his execution date. This time, the authorities took no chances. They placed 6 guards on constant surveillance, and the windows and exits of his cell were fortified more than ever before, with openings reduced to a size barely large enough for his head. Yet, in a critical oversight, they neglected to restrain him. He was left unbound. At first, Shiratori appeared exhausted, and his spirit seemed broken. The weariness of age and constant imprisonment had dulled his once indomitable will. He spent his days lying in his cell, indifferent to the guards' calls and their periodic beatings. For a time, the guards grew bored with him, and the routine became monotonous. They no longer expected him to react. But then, one night, when they entered his cell expecting to find him motionless under his blanket, they were shocked to find he had vanished. All that remained was a pile of wooden panels. For the first time, Shiratori's escape came from beneath the earth. His gaze at the ceiling had been nothing but a clever ruse, a way to mislead the guards into thinking he was contemplating his escape through the ceiling while he worked tirelessly to tunnel through the floor. Using only a soup bowl to dig, he spent night after night chipping away at the wood beneath him. The guard's routine of ignoring his presence allowed him the undisturbed time he needed to complete his plan. Over the course of a month, he managed to dig a tunnel, escaping once again, but this time it was through the ground. Shiratori's fourth escape, oddly enough, proved to be the simplest of all. He had outsmarted the guards with a strategy they had never anticipated. His days of running from prison were not yet over, but this escape was his last, at least for a while. After some time, while sitting on a bench in a public garden, Shiratori had an unexpected encounter. A man approached him and sat down. At first, Shiratori tensed up, noticing the man was a police officer. He feared recognition, but the officer was surprisingly friendly, offering him a cigarette from his case. Cigarettes were a rare and valuable commodity at the time, and the officer's simple, kind gesture left a profound impression on Shiratori. Perhaps, he thought, not all authorities were corrupt. Maybe the country and its people had changed. This moment of unexpected kindness, combined with growing reports of significant reforms in the justice system, stirred something in Shiratori. Despite his solemn vow never to trust again, especially after being betrayed by Kobayashi, the prison guard who had once been his ally, he felt the stirrings of hope. Tired of being relentlessly pursued, weary of constantly escaping, Shiratori made a decision. He chose to surrender. The case of the dead farmer was eventually reclassified as self-defense. Given the questionable circumstances surrounding his initial imprisonment and his forced confession under torture, Shiratori's sentences were significantly reduced. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of early release. His case became one of the most discussed legal and media stories in Japan, symbolizing the ongoing reform of the nation's prison and justice systems. Shiratori spent the remainder of his sentence in a Tokyo prison, where conditions were far more humane than those he had previously endured. The guards treated him with respect, and, for the first time, he found a sense of peace within the prison walls. His behavior remained exemplary, and in 1961, after serving 14 years of his sentence, he was granted early release. And so, the story of Yoshi Shiratori came to an end. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe our channel.